I want to welcome us into what is this final week before we land on the holiday of Christmas. And it is helpful, I think, for us to grasp that that word holiday really means holy day. Now, for most of us now, the word holiday is used in such a broad sense. It kind of refers to we get some maybe time off of work or from school, and so that's what we think of as the holidays. But really, at the root is a holy day. And perhaps among the greatest is that of Christmas, which we speak of again with so many cultural trappings, but it really is the Mass, which means the gathering of people of Christ. It is that unique gathering that we come to around Christ, which is the term that means literally the anointed one. Jesus the Christ, the anointed one, the fulfillment of all that God had spoken of to humanity, all of what God was fulfilling in sending one who would be like any other. So as we have engaged in the recent weeks, we realize that the people had said, God, we want to have a king of our own as a nation. Now, God had been their ruler and their king and their supreme and their superior, but they wanted to have a king so that they could have their national identity restored, and they would once again feel good about themselves. And God knew that that may not go well, that there will be something about earthly rulers that will always disappoint you. But God allowed them to have a king, and some were good and some were not, but in the end, every king failed. And as a nation, they were a people who found themselves in darkness when the pagan culture seemed to once again rule across the very land that had been promised to them, and all their hopes were in that place. And that is where we hear the prophet Isaiah speak out, as we've been reminded in recent weeks, those words that are so familiar and so often, at least a portion of them, heard in this season. And I would bring us to again where the prophet Isaiah says in Isaiah chapter 9, of those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. For to us a child is born, and to us a son is given. And the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace, there will be no end. Here these words were spoken, and the people were drawn to the idea that this is not merely something that is going to quickly take place. This is about one who would come, who would be a king of another nature, a king who would somehow be uniquely God's king and represent something unending. And you may recall that these words were written 700 years before the coming of Christ. The people continued to live in a darkness and even silence. They had not heard from the prophets for 400 years when one comes to a young woman named Mary. And what was it that was spoken over her but these very words, in which she was told that she will have child, and he will be called the Son of the Most High, and his kingdom there will have no end. Clearly what's being described is that which is a king, but of a whole nother nature, a king who is ultimately reflecting the very rulership of the heavens over the earth. And this is what the Apostle Paul describes so kind of profoundly and in big language. When we read in Colossians, he says this of Christ and who he was, the one who was born. He says, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. In those words, he's reminding us, as we engaged last week, that who this child is one who transcends all time and space. And even as scientists point to the fact that somehow our existence in time and space was preceded by that which is beyond time and space. So it is that this Christ, the one who was born, the one that's in that manger, is one who now brings that which is beyond all time and space into time and space, nothing less than that. One who rules, but in a matter that is greater. As C.S. Lewis once described in the Chronicles of Narnia, he said, once in our world, a stable had something in it that was bigger than our whole world. That what exists in that child that came into this world is that which is greater than everything in this world. He is not merely a king, and we have to allow our imaginations to realize that what is so clear is this is not merely an alternative king or a better king, but this is the King of Kings, as he's designated, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. A king is one who has authority and sovereignty. The King of Kings is one who has authority and sovereignty over all and over all other rulers, one who is distinct in what they represent. And if we dare to look, what we see in the child in the manger is one who would come to defy all the powers that have ruled over this earth, all the powers that this earth has trusted in, all the powers that we are enamored with and that we tend to think of as powerful. He would defy those, and he would bring that which is of a higher power, and it challenges us. It challenges us because we tend to look upon the child, and we see in the nativity scene how the idea of a baby born in such vulnerable conditions, it can cause us to have this kind of sympathetic, sentimental, protective nature, like, oh, we want to look down upon him with sympathy. And we need to realize, no, this is the King of all kings. And what he brings to bear is that which is confronting all that we've ever known. And that is why I believe he was born at such a unique time, for he was born into the very time of the Roman Empire, arguably the most vast and powerful and lasting empire that this world has ever known throughout all of human history. Many perceive it to have ruled over more lands and had greater control and greater stability, and ultimately its ruler, Caesar, would declare himself to be akin to a deity and would call for people to bow to him as such a deity because the empire was so great. What else could he be? And it's into this, on the edge of that Roman Empire, that a child is born in the outskirts and to a couple that nobody could ever have even noticed. And that is what becomes so interesting. What arose was dramatic and defining. And we see this child as they continue to speak of very different powers and very different dynamics, finally brought before the Roman Empire, pressed in. Who are you? And are you here to overthrow this empire? And we come to a point in which Jesus is finally brought before Pilate, as many of you recall. And Pilate is the representative ruler of Rome in this territory, and he's brought before him. And Pilate's in this uncomfortable position. You can feel his tension. For Pilate is back and forth with the religious leaders who are calling for his crucifixion ultimately. But they keep saying that he's a threat to Rome. And they keep saying there's only one king, and that is Caesar. And they're putting this pressure on him, but he can't figure it out because he keeps taking Jesus away. And as he talks to him, there is no sense of threat that Jesus is trying to overthrow Rome. But at the same time, he keeps asking him, but then what are you about? Why do they keep claiming that you are claiming to be a king? And finally, Jesus declares those words familiar to some, where Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world, nor does it have its origins in this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighting hard to keep me from being handed over But as it is, my kingdom is not of this world. As one said well, he said, Jesus is essentially saying, my kingdom, the kingdom that is mine, is not of this world. Neither now nor at any future period will it derive its origin from this world. His royal power and state are not furnished by earthly force or fleshly ordinances or physical energies or material wealth or imperial armies. What he is drawing from is entirely distinct from the powers of this world. Pilate is entirely perplexed, wondering, well, then what is it that you hold? And why are we even in this engagement? Who are you? What kind of king are you? And we have to wonder, I was thinking, like, if Pilate was able to go forward, he would look back as we can today and realize that you can go to Rome. My wife and I had the privilege of going recently, and there's not much left of that empire. It's wonderful to see the ruins, but it's just ruins. That is what's left of the Roman Empire. None of the authority that Caesar had was able to sustain itself. He controlled people, but eventually people defied that authority. And that empire, as it was known, is no longer. But what of Jesus? What of the one who said, I am operating by a very different power? Of him, more books are now written than of any other person who's ever existed on this planet. Of him, there are whole governments, whole nations who root their very governance by his words. There are more hospitals and means to serve human life and care for human life that have been created by those who follow him. There's over 100 universities that were established by his followers, including Harvard and Yale and Dartmouth, and all, we could go on and on. There are more people in this world that claim him to be their Savior and their King than any other. That is profound. That is profound, and we wonder if Pilate could only see what had come. There are more changes in this world in terms of our ethics and our sense about humanity. It was his Sermon on the Mount that so many have drawn upon to elevate the ethics of humanity. It was the way that he challenged the idea that women and the poor are cursed, that broke the power of the indignity that had been controlling the very role of women and the poor in this world. Jesus said they are not the cursed, and he restored that kind of dignity. Slavery was abolished both in Britain and the United States based on the teachings of Jesus. That is what they contended for. And we could go on and on. This is a power that is unlike any other. The one who stood before Pilate was the one who defied the powers of this world. And we need to be able to look upon that child and realize that he is this defiant king operating on a higher power. For most of us, we realize that it is the nature of kings to generally do what? To live in royalty, to have lavish lifestyles, to call people to loyalty and force it upon them, to be separated and elevated from people. And all of these things Jesus fundamentally defied. Everything that normally is given power and we trust in as a source of power, he defied. And we can look upon those kinds of kings and their lavishness, and we're a democracy. We don't like kings. But the truth is, if we're really honest, we still trust, I believe, very much in the very powers that Jesus defied. And so I want to challenge us that part of what it means to look upon this child is not merely to say, oh yes, oh the lavish. He's such an inspiring figure, that Jesus, because he came among the poor. But rather to see that he's defying powers and doing so in a way that he called us to defy, to trust in what he sets forth, not what this world sets forth as power. And the truth is, if I'm honest, I still place great trust in those powers. I still want to look upon the child with kind of sentimentality, but not allow him to be the one who confronts me in what I'm truly trusting in. And so I want us to take a moment to consider just what those differences are. And the first is this, that Christ defies the power of prominence and prosperity. An earthly king is known for their prominence, their prosperity, the castle, the palace, and the people would tend to find security in that. If the king has a great palace, it means somehow that we're more secure, that we're bigger, because, hey, I don't get to live in there, but I get to what? Associate with the prominence. I get to feel I vicariously live through the prominence that at least our king has. And that might sound like something we scoff at, like something that we go, oh yeah, I hate that. I hate that there's people who seem like they're so famous. And the truth is, we scoff at it, but we are more given to it than we've ever been. There is, I think, nothing more powerful and pervasive than our draw towards prominence, towards attention. Oscar Wilde once said in one of his playwrights, he said that there is only one thing that is worse than having people talk about you. It's having them not talk about you. Like, we want to have a sense that we're important, and as the world gets larger, it just seems like it evolves even more. There's always been in this world the sense of those who are known. There's heroes, and eventually there were famous people because you could become famous. There was enough communications to do that. But then we reached the age of celebrities, and now we have social influencers. And they have found that the greatest power in marketing is to just associate with celebrities. Why are we so drawn? We're so drawn because, if we're really honest, it is, as some sociologists would say, our deep need to live vicariously bigger than life. We have such a struggle to face life in all of our weakness and all of our limitations, in all of what seems to be the vanity of life itself. Like, what is there? Like, what is it that really is important? Oh, but if I see somebody living bigger than life, hey, we'll pay our NBA stars, our NFL stars, our music stars. We don't care how much money they make, as long as what? We can live vicariously bigger than life through them. That's really why we are willing to see so much flow, because we have that deep need. Jesus understood the power of prominence, but he utterly defies it. Jesus was not afraid of the one thing that most of us, if we're really honest, are deeply afraid of, and it's obscurity. Jesus was born to a couple, like really outside teenagers. He was born in a barn. Nobody knew about it. Nobody paid attention to it. By the age of 2, he was a refugee in Egypt, probably through the age of 6, living as a displaced person. Then he spent his years just working as a carpenter. Jesus defies the very nature of what we think gives power. His authority came not from his prominence, not from his prosperity. His authority, as we find, came because he defied those things, because he understood that that kind of prominence, when it's used as a source of power, will only create superiority and separation between people. See, the king lives in their palace, and the king is by nature one who has to say, you can only come by permission into my presence. It's that kind of separation that takes place. Now, there's nothing wrong with a healthy sense of attention. We have many fields by which people make great contributions, and it's good that those things are recognized. They can truly serve the good of people. So it is not a matter of we need to kind of renounce all attention. No, there is that great place for attention. But it is this idea that one becomes more prominent that one becomes more separated, that Jesus defies, and it's by that power that Jesus was able to welcome all. And we find that Jesus goes into places in which no king would ever go. When they would walk along the side of the road and they thought, he's the king of the universe, like they're trying to figure this out. What was most perplexing is they would walk by somebody who was a beggar on the side of the road. They had been begging their whole lives. Nobody even paid attention. Nobody even would notice them, but Jesus did. Jesus had no problem being present with those who were the least and the left out. Those for whom there was no sense that anybody else could really matter. Like nobody else cares that you're taking time with them. You're stopping by a Samaritan woman and talking to this woman who had 5 husbands and now she's with another man. And I don't get it. Why? We passed her by. We thought she's just a Samaritan. But see, Jesus is defying this power of prominence because he is the king who doesn't see us the same way. See, we have the idea of equality based on everybody being okay. So we have to keep elevating that we value equality. Let's just keep affirming that everybody's okay. But Jesus, he values equality in a whole different way. And that is that everybody is sick. And that everybody's equally sick and equally broken and equally in need of him. So he sees all as equals and he comes to all as equals and he brings dignity to all as equals. And that is how Jesus is so distinct. And we wonder, how does he defy this? And it's not based on you never hear Jesus say, hey, I don't care what anybody thinks, because that's our great line. Like, I'm so independent, I don't care what anybody thinks. Anyone who tells you that, and if you say it, it's not true. You deeply care about what people think. Let's just be honest. Like we all do. We try not to, so we try to say, I don't care what anybody thinks of me. But the truth is, we will find ourselves going, but I'm trying hard to find prominence and significance. But Jesus found it within himself. That's what made him. Jesus had prominence and he had prosperity, but it was with his Father. This is why Jesus constantly shows us that the real power is to live in the prominence of the audience of one that is within. This is what he reveals as he shows us how to live. And what we see is that Christ defies the power of prominence and prosperity and bore the power to meet humanity in all its weakness. And he did this because Jesus wasn't defined and driven to perform for the audience around him as much as the audience within him. He had an inner spiritual attention and prominence in his relationship with the Father. He cultivated that relationship. He kept trying to explain to people, to understand me, you need to understand, I am doing what the Father tells me. I am following and doing what the Father is doing. And I'm living out of this place in which I am cultivating his attention and his significance. And it doesn't matter so much what other people see because I know what he sees. And what he's inviting you and I to do is to join that power in which we are living our lives in relationship to the one who first and fully sees us. And when we live into the relationship inwardly to one who first and fully sees us, we are able to live out of something that is a higher power, more powerful than the mere prominence and prosperity of this world. And that is not easy. Jesus knew it wasn't easy. Jesus kept confronting his followers when they're saying, who gets to sit at your right hand? Who gets to have prominence? And he kept saying, you don't understand. In this kingdom, the first will be last and the last will be first. In this kingdom, it's not like the world of the Gentiles who lord it over others. He kept trying to explain to them that in this kingdom, it is the power of that which can identify with the most common human weaknesses we share. And that challenges me. It challenges me deeply because at times it's so much about what people see. And yet I know that if I was to care for somebody and nobody sees it, it is in that moment that I feel there's something distinct going on. There's something of this other power going on. There's something of, well, does God see? And I sense God's presence right there. God's presence when I serve somebody and nobody sees it. When I stop for somebody in need. And you know that feeling too. I know you do. And I know you know that it's even different when nobody sees it. Because Jesus says, that's where my presence is. And when you come into that presence, you're operating out of a power that defies the things of this world. That is who is in that manger. He is defying that. But I want to go on and note, secondly, and we'll note more quickly, that Christ defies the power of using authority to be served. It is the nature, we would say, of kings that everybody must be loyal to them and serve them, and they can kind of call on people because they are their what? Their subjects. That is how we can tend to live in the world. If I have more subjects, if I have more people who serve me, well, then I have more power. And this, of course, is what Jesus himself would speak against. He would say that I have come to defy that power. Jesus, we read in Mark 10, called his disciples together and said, you know that those who were regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. These are the words by which Jesus is describing this is the higher power that is operating. It is not that which calls people and demands their service, but that which has the power to serve others. And you and I know something of that. It is one thing to feel like, well, people are doing what I say, or they have obligation, or somehow, they must follow by coercion what they're doing. But it's another thing to be able to actually lift up others, to be able to serve them, to be able to meet that need, to be able to give ourselves. Because when we give ourselves, we are giving. We have the power to realize that our life can affect others. When others serve us, that's not true. But when we serve others, that is when we realize the power that God has given to us to be able to serve others. This becomes the greatest power. And Jesus wants to be very clear that this dynamic is different. And so we see that Christ defies this power of authority to serve, and he bore the power to give himself in service and sacrifice. And it's important that he makes it clear that he gave himself. There's a point in which he is heading towards his own sacrifice, and he wants to be very clear. He says, nobody, let me be clear, nobody is taking my life. I gave it. It's very important. He's distinguishing something. It is not merely about being a pawn to the whims and wishes of everybody else around you. That is not service. That is really sometimes a very destructive thing. It's about choosing intentionally to serve another or to give of oneself. So Jesus says, let me be clear. Nobody took my life or is taking my life. I am giving it. That is power. And it defies the power that demands. And so we come and see that it is this that Jesus was trying to impart, that the way that the kingdom of heaven ultimately works, this eternal kingdom, the one that's going to be remaining, the one that the child was born to rule, the one that he's inviting us into, it is that in which it really is more blessed to give than to receive. And that's hard for us, and it almost seems like it goes against everything that this coming week is about, right? Because it's all about making our list and figuring out what we want to get. But there's also that part of us that can realize that there is something so true about it. But it's not just a sentimental ideal. It's actually about what true power is and how it affects change. I can't help but thinking about a young man who was born around 280 AD. And he was born into a town that was at that time a small Roman town in what is modern-day Turkey. And at a young age, both of his parents were killed. And he gained an inheritance, but having lost his parents, he could have just taken that and used it. But there was something different about him, and it was because of the impact that Christ had on his life and his understanding. And so he used what he had gained to be able to give to those in need. But he did it in secret, and that was a big part of how he went about his life. And one story is how there was a man who had 3 daughters, and all of them were now at a place in which they needed their dowries, and they were so destitute that the father was going to have to give them into servitude or worse. But this man, he took bags of money and he placed it in the dark at their doorstep. And this would change the outcome of their lives, and this is what he would do regularly. And he would go on to be one who would serve his town as a businessman, as a lawyer, as a judge, but also ultimately as a pastor, and then ultimately as a bishop. And finally, he would be deemed a saint. His name was Nicholas, Saint Nicholas, and you may have heard of him. And over time, his reputation grew because he challenged the way that things were and the way people did things. And it inspired people so much that so much would come about, and the way that people would look upon this saint and the different forms they might give to him. But at the root of it was the fact that he believed that there was a greater power at work in that child that was born, and that it was the power of giving more than receiving. It was the power to be able to affect others and give of oneself. That was at the root. And when he was born, his small town was that in which those who were followers of Jesus, those who were followers of this Christ, were persecuted they were a small group of persecuted lives. By the time his life ended, it had become the dominant belief of the town because he had that kind of impact. And I think he reminds us that really at the heart of Christmas is a choice between 2 powers, that which demands service and that which gives of ourselves. And finally, we see that Christ defies the power of human force. The world has long known the power of fear and force. They have always been at work in this world, from the days of dictators and kings long ago to those of current day. But there's so many ways in which we use coercion and force and fear. It's constantly at work. Much of what we do is driven by the fear and the forces, whether they be physical or emotional, that are brought upon us. And that seems to rule. It seems to be kind of like the final thing you can do if you have to is just use force. And you will be able to show that you are more powerful. And certainly the Bible speaks of governments as of rightfully having and bearing the sword, because there is a need to contain evil in this age. But it is always deemed to be the least of all powers, because it can do nothing more than contain evil. It cannot bring about good. It never has. And this is what Jesus brings forth into the world. This is what changes. You may recall how when Jesus was born, you can see these 2 things coming at the very beginning, that the one coming vulnerable as a child, the one who would be calling people to love and change their ways because of his love, was born at a time in which a ruler named Herod was the local ruler. And when he heard that these magi were coming from Persia to look for this child who was to be called a king, that he was deeply threatened by that. And so, as you may recall, he calls for the slaughter of all children all the male children under the age of 2, because he knew that child had been born somewhere in this window of time and they had come looking. And that's what you do when you feel threatened. When you feel that your own sense of power is going to be threatened, you do whatever it is to kill that. And how opposite it would be as time would go on and you would see these two powers come. One would kill those who threaten him. One would give his life for those who threaten him. And we need to look upon that child and ask ourselves, what is more powerful, the one who will kill or the one who will die? And I think that that question is not a simple one. The answer to that question, though, really is going to define what I see in that child who's in the manger. When I look at the nativity scene, what will I see? Will I see one who, that poor kid, I feel kind of a sentimental sympathy for him. So vulnerable, and he grows up and he gives his life, and I'm inspired by him. Oh yeah, don't get me wrong. He's a source of inspiration that I can look down upon. That is the way that our culture has come to look at the nativity scene, kind of as a source of this ethereal inspiration where we can look down upon the blessed child, put a little halo around him on the Hallmark card, and just see him as kind of a source of inspiration. Or are we looking at the one who is the King of Kings and defies all the powers of this world, and who is calling us not merely to be those who see him as a source of inspiration, but who actually follow him? For Jesus, and this is the invitation I would put to us, Jesus did not come and say, hey, I want to inspire you to try to be a little more sacrificial. Jesus says, I'm calling you to follow me. I'm calling you to follow me. I'm calling you and I to be those who follow him in the ways of the power of the kingdom, and to realize that nothing on this earth, no kingdom will last. Everything will ultimately fall. There is no powers in this earth that will ultimately rule, but he does. He is that eternal king. And what he has called us to is that which is truly everlasting. He's calling us into a kingdom that will never end, but it will not prevail by the powers of this world. And so he's challenging us to ask, what do we see in the child that was born in that manger? Do we see and realize that he is the one who is operating by higher powers, truly higher powers, truly the ways in which we are to operate? He's challenging us to ask ourselves, what do we really trust in? And that, I would say to you, is hard. Like, if we really get honest, that's hard. Like, if I was to get really honest, I would say there's a lot of me that if I honestly look at my life, I trust in prominence, prosperity. Just look at what I'm focused on. Look at what I'm doing. Look at where I'm really saying, well, that's really powerful. I mean, God, that's spiritual power. But what I really trust in is prominence, prosperity, attention. I'm afraid of obscurity. Anybody else? That I want to say I don't believe in force. I don't believe violence is ultimately going to win. But actually, I love the movies where the hero comes out and kicks butt and just wipes everyone else out, for a good cause, of course. But it's I really believe in violence, if I'm honest. I actually think human force I trust in. And it challenges me. Who do I see in that manger? Do I really believe that he is more powerful than everything in this world? That's the invitation. And I invite us as we come into this week to be those who, as we have this final week, and we're going to see a few manger scenes, and we're going to imagine, and we're going to think about and focus on the child that was born and on his birth. To look upon him and see that he is confronting us with all that we trust in, and that we shake off that tendency to look at the child with sentimental sympathy and say, look at him, he's so sweet. And we realize that we need real awe when we look at that child, because he rules the universe. And nothing in this world, no power, can stand against him. Let's pray. God, we are those who live in the midst of this wonderful season that we continue to refer to as Christmas. And we know that it really does call us up to look upon your birth into this world, when heaven came into earth and united with us. And you've come as a king, that we come honestly as those who know that our culture can create for us a sense in which so safe and sentimental, but you are king. And we pray that we might be opening our hearts to be challenged by you. We know that you have come to liberate us from the power of earthly force and fear. You've come because you know that our obedience is ultimately that which comes by love. That we would realize that you love us, and that we might learn to love and want to please you so much that we would come. That love is more powerful than force. And you've proven it. And now it's for us to join it. God, we pray that you would help transform for us, that in a world that is still full of pride, and that pride can run through us. We're insecure creatures who try to be more than we are. We pray that you would help us to understand that truly you lift up the humble. For humility is power when it's entrusted to you. You are our humble King. Let's stand and worship together.